Mark chapter 3, verses 20 through 35. And the crowd came together again, so that they could not even eat. When his family heard it, they went out to restrain him. For people were saying, "He has gone out of his mind." And the scribes who came down from Jerusalem said, "He has Beelzebul, and by the ruler of the demons he casts out demons." And he called them to himself and spoke to them in parables. "How can Satan cast out Satan? If a kingdom is divided against itself, that kingdom cannot stand. And if a house is divided against itself, that house will not be able to stand. And if Satan has risen up against himself and is divided, he cannot stand, but his end has come. But no one can enter a strong man's house and plunder his property without first tying up the strong man. Then indeed the house can be plundered. Truly I tell you, people will be forgiven for their sins and whatever blasphemies they utter. But whoever blasphemes against the Holy Spirit can never have forgiveness, but is guilty of an eternal sin. For they had said, 'He has an unclean spirit.' Then his mother and his brothers came, and standing outside, they sent to him and called him. The crowd was sitting around him, and they said to him, 'Your mother and brothers and sisters are outside, asking for you.' And he replied, 'Who are my mother and my brothers?' And looking at those who sat around him, he said, 'Here are my mother and my brothers. Whoever does the will of God is my brother and sister and mother.'" The living God still speaks today. Thanks be to God. More often than we'd like to think, our priorities don't quite match up with those of Jesus. We don't give a lot of thought to that. We just tend to go on with our lives and ignore some of the things to which Jesus has called us. Perhaps this comes with greatest visibility in our economic and political lives. Our tendency is to keep those aspects of our lives rather detached from questions of faith. What does Jesus have to do with how I spend my money, how I vote, foreign policy, national immigration policy, how our penal system operates, how we establish zoning ordinances, or how we structure our healthcare system? This tendency to separate the secular from our faith responsibilities creates distinctions that would restrain and limit Jesus to a narrow slice of our lives. How far do we take this restraining of Jesus? Jesus' family was not against him. They were not intent on causing him harm. They were not on a quest to imprison him or exclude him from their lives. They went to restrain him, according to Mark's account, not to cause him harm, but to help him. Jesus needed an intervention. Jesus needed someone to set him down and protect him from himself. He was making enemies of the wrong sorts of people. He was speaking out in ways that threatened his very own life. He had lost his attachment to reality as far as they were concerned. Oh, and they were not the only ones thinking along these lines. Out of their love and concern for Jesus, his mother, brothers, sisters came to take him home and bring him back to his senses. If they had not loved or cared for him, they would have ignored him. They wouldn't have bothered. They would just have abandoned him and allow him to freely endanger his own life. They would have just washed their hands of him, let him go. It was their concern, however, that brought them to Jesus in today's text, hoping to restrain him. Take him back home. Get him some much needed therapy, some clarity. To all appearances, he did not understand just how much of a problem he was creating for himself. He needed them to fix him. He needed to learn more restraint. He needed to understand his limits. Indeed, Jesus' family were not the only ones recognizing that Jesus was pushing the wrong buttons. Last week's passage ended with some of the Pharisees and Herodians joining forces to find some way to entrap and silence Jesus for good. That was a real threat. Jesus did not seem to understand just how much of a ruckus he was creating. He was stepping on toes, but especially on the toes of those who held the reins of power. He was threatening to upset the solidity and structure of Jewish life in such a way that it could all come crashing down in on itself. There would be a fierce response to that. He was making himself a visible target, one who was undermining the very foundation of the social order around him. Unlike his family, others were looking askance at Jesus with less considerate eyes. They were not so much concerned with silencing him for his own benefit. They were concerned over him creating more disruption in their already difficult lives. Their cries that Jesus was out of his mind both recognized that he was placing himself at odds with established society, as well as taking more than a bridge too far. His words had the potential to incite social upheaval. And that might cause problems not only among the Jews, but also in relation to Roman occupation. Jesus was out of his mind. He did not know how far to press his agenda. He was making people uncomfortable. People who mattered. People who called the shots. People who had pull, authority, and power. They weren't completely against him, but he needed to practice restraint. Their message to Jesus was something like, sure, preach the good news of Yahweh. Tell us Messiah is on the way. Tell us the long-awaited messianic reign is just around the corner. Spread hope. Invigorate the religious community. Call everyone back to Yahweh. Go ahead and talk about love. Just stop short of calling for any change that would really challenge life's known and established structures, the way we do things. Leave Sabbath observance alone. Just heal people during the other 6 days of the week. Don't be so hard on those who are actually religious and take Yahweh and Torah seriously. Don't go out of your way to upset them. They need some kudos. Give them a little coddling. You can catch more flies with honey, with sugar, than with vinegar. Lay off condemning the wealthy. After all, we're all indebted to them. And they have the power to make life easier or harder on us. Let sleeping dogs lie. The harder you push them, the harder they will come back on the rest of us. Yes, they are claiming you have an evil spirit or are serving the prince of the gods of all the pagan nations around. Just brush that off and don't muddy the waters by responding to their absurdity. You've already made your point that a lot of people are being neglected by society. We're not asking you to stop all of that, but tone it down just a bit. Be quieter. Don't stir up trouble by preaching to crowds, as that makes everyone nervous. Step back. Show restraint. You're going to get yourself killed. You're going to get lots of people killed. Sounds pretty reasonable, doesn't it? They wanted Jesus to use a gentler approach that would not ruffle so many feathers. They wanted to tell him that change takes time. They wanted him to think in terms of generational shifts. They wanted him to take a safer, less risky approach. They did not want people to come back on them for somehow being responsible for his revolutionary ideas. His attacks on the religious and political establishment in Israel. Beyond getting in trouble with the Pharisees, Herodian scribes, Rome was watching too. That's our usual approach to change, isn't it? Give it time. Stop watching the pot. The arc of history tends toward justice, but it moves slowly. You can't just turn an aircraft carrier on a dime. Look at all the progress we've made in the last 50 years. We can only handle so much change at one time. There's a reason we've done it this way for so long. Cool your jets. Slow and steady wins the race. It seems that's not quite how Jesus saw the issues before him. No, he was not some hothead who was trying to stir up trouble and incite some rebellion. On the other hand, he was unwilling to be silent while people around him were being continually oppressed by the status quo. The good news of God's reign he was preaching would disturb the status quo. It would disturb the structures around him in the first century. It would disturb the structures around us as well. It already has. And we are still living with repercussions of that. Slavery? Now we have prison labor. migrant workers, and a workforce dependent on taking whatever pay they can get. Racism? Yes, it's still going strong. We still have churches that don't want to accept clergy from a different race or ethnic background. Sexism? Pay for women is still not equal. We still have not passed the Equal Rights Amendment. We've never elected a woman president. Mexico just did. If we applied the principle of love your neighbor as yourself, we would not have so many social problems around us that abound. There would be no housing crisis. There would be no mental health crisis. There would be no health care inequality. There would be no economic inequality resulting in hungry children. Our concerns over border security would shift to humanitarian concerns for our neighbors. When will we learn to quit restraining Jesus, silencing him, telling him to just cool it? Give it time.